Is Toryism dead in Canada, and are red Tories nothing but socialists? Check it out.
It's not very liberal of a liberal not to critique liberalism, but most liberals don't do that. And the irony is that a certain type of liberalism holds high critical thinking, but they're not often critical of liberalism itself as an ideology. Toryism, historically, at its best, is a concern for the common good, or the classical English notion, the common weal or the commonwealth, at a general idea, and then the role of state and society working together for that good.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Sean Whatley, and today we have Ron Dart, Professor Ron Dart. He's author of over 40 books, but in particular, he's an expert on Toryism, red Toryism, in fact. Most of our discussion centered on his book, The North American High Tory Tradition. But he's written on George Grant, Stephen Leacock, and a number of other Tory authors in the Canadian experience. Now, what's interesting about Professor Dart is he was trained in the classical tradition, so we could say he's a classicist, but he's also had an acute interest with politics. So he marries classics plus day-to-day politics, and so he gets into the political issues of the day. Now, I found our conversation a challenge to what I think. When I started reading his book 9 years ago, when it came out, I thought, oh, this guy's just a socialist. And so I pressed him on that. And although the first impression you get is that Professor Dart really highlights the role of the state in society, when you actually start asking questions about him, for example, would George Grant be ideologically opposed to any kind of public-private partnership in healthcare or education? And Professor Dart says, no, he would be okay with that. So he highlights the need for tension, nuance, and complexity in public policy. But at first impression, his first response makes you jump back. At least it makes me jump back as someone who has aversion to the big state and state control. So it was a good challenge for me. Something that kept me awake, actually. I recorded this introduction the day after our interview. Normally I record it right after the interview because everything's fresh in my mind. But I had to wait for a day to think over what's eating at me. And a theme that was eating at me during the conversation was this idea of innovation. Every group you talk to blames some point in history as the cliff over which Western civilization plummeted, and everything's been downhill since there. So the Catholics point to the Reformation. The Protestants often point to the Enlightenment. The socialists point to, and then the Marxists point to the Industrial Revolution. But there are many points in history that we could identify and say everything went to hell after that. So, for example, the printing press. Well, the printing press gave information to the people, or the abandonment of the Latin Mass, or the Great Schism of 1054 between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Think of Leo Strauss saying, no, we have to go back to the Greek and Romans. Everything after that, society's downhill from there. So everybody has a point at which they want to stand with respect to a particular innovation that happens in history, and then say everything outside of that is liberalism or individualism or hyper-individualism. So I haven't sorted this out, but I hope you'll notice that tension within our talk. I can't wait to have another conversation with him. He's challenged a lot of my thinking, and hopefully I can challenge him a bit also. Anyways, thanks so much for stopping by. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and let's get on with the show. Welcome, Professor Dart.
Wonderful to be with you.
I've been looking forward to this. I was just mentioning before we started recording that my daughter just got married at St. George's, a church that you mentioned in this book, The North American High Tory Tradition. And very interesting to hear you write and talk about Stephen Leacock and George Grant. And I was also telling you, though, in the green room, that when I first picked up your book in 2016, I couldn't understand it. I was very much deep in my liberalism thinking, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist. And I've come around by a very, very slow path to more of what I'm calling an intellectual conservatism, a classical conservatism. And so I'm trying to find out the breadth and depth of thinking on the non-left in Canada. And a component of that is the high Tory tradition or the Tory tradition overall. So I wonder if you could define for us, what is Toryism?
Well, Toryism, historically, at its best, at a philosophical, political level, is a concern for the common good, or the classical English notion, the common weal or the commonwealth, at a general idea, and then the role of state and society working together for that good. Now, the state, as you rightly note, can become excessively bureaucratic and administrative. In that way, it betrays its own vision, what it's meant to be. And that's why you get certain forms of right-of-center conservatism that say society is the way to deal with our contemporary dilemmas and the state is the problem. And there's the danger in ideology at the present time. If you go too far left, the state is the answer to our problems. The reply to that on the right, no, society is grassroots up versus top down. Both have goods in them, and both have their own dark sides and shadows and reactionary tendencies. A high Tory takes the distinctive and historic position that both have goods, and when they work together for the common good, you have a greater good. When they go at one another, you have lesser goods. And so, but both can distort and can counterfeit who they actually are if they have inadequate people running the horse, as it were.
And low Tory?
Well, low Toryism often has some affinities with what today we call conservatism. And significant forms of conservatism come out of an old, what we call classical liberal tradition of Locke and Smith. And there's a whole tradition there that are somewhat suspicious of the state. And in economics, the market is going to solve the problem. And to more people are given freedom to exercise their personal, their religious, their economic means, the greater the sense of the common good. And so the dilemma of that is when you set free the individual to do it what they wish, you get fragmentation. So what brings some sort of larger collective unity amongst the people? And the state has a very important role to play in that. And Canada has an amazing tradition at our best of the common good, an important role of a federal government and provincial and municipal and how they work or don't work together, but at their best, should be some sort of symphony. But anything where there are humans involved, there's going to be distortions, misreads, people turning on one another, but that doesn't mean you lose the ideal.
So it sounds good, but everybody knows there's a but coming. Many people are saying that, you think of Gad Horowitz, we just have a Tory touch, that's all.
Yes.
Another few pieces I've seen recently written saying that, people are trying to revive Toryism. Toryism is dead. George Grant himself lamented the passing of Canada with the passing of a old style of conservatism now that we're being colonized by the liberalism from the South. So is Toryism dead in Canada?
I think Toryism, as an overarching way of understanding the human public good, has been fragmented. And there's no doubt about that. Like a Ming vase, which has been tossed off the shelf, it's splintered into multiple pieces. And so the communal vision or the collective vision or the comprehensive vision, there's no doubt that has been shattered. But what's happened is the right, the center, and the left have picked up various pieces of that puzzle. So the Green Party, with its emphasis on environmental responsibility, that's a very Tory position. The tension between economics and ecology, very, very important. Leftist parties like the NDP and soft left liberalism, the notion of the role of the state in providing affordable health care and in time, hopefully more affordable education, depending how we move forward on it. On the other hand, the right's emphasis on the role of society, the role of community, the role of family. These are important as well. So what was once an integrated and organic vision, like an exquisite Ming vase, has been dashed to the floor, and the different pieces do exist, but different ideological tendencies then have taken up the pieces and then converted them into their own ideological vision, and then they go into the culture wars themselves, and they contest one another, they collide, they rhetorically charge one another. Whereas a Tory transcends that sort of tribalism. And if you're a Tory, there'll be times like a Leacock or a Grant you have mentioned where you'll seem to be on the right. And there'll be another times when you seem to be on the left. A lot of it hinges on the issue and the justification philosophically and theologically, how you come to those conclusions. So it's not that it's disappeared, it's been dispersed.
Is red Toryism one fragment of the vase, or is red Toryism the whole vase?
No, red Toryism, you had mentioned Gad Howard's. That term was coined in his relationship with George Grant, and George Grant made it clear he was not a red Tory. People like Howard's and Laxer, and this group that were in the waffle movement in the late 1960s that opposed the NDP under Lewis, waffling to the right. The Howard's, Laxer, and others, Robin Matthews, said we should be waffling to the left. George Grant took a position in that period of time, particularly Lament for a Nation, which you have mentioned. It's 60 years this year since Lament was published, and a new book is just coming out, which I've contributed to, on Lament, commentaries on Lament, and it's just updating. And did Grant really lament the passing away? Or, I mean, under people like Howard, it's a clarion call to return to an older tradition. But what that group, the Waffles, were, they blended what they saw socialism and nationalism. Grant was never a socialist. He was a Tory, but he was a nationalist in that sense. And so Red Tory is a child of tensions in the 1960s between the Waffle left and Grant, who was a Tory nationalist but not a socialist nationalist. So they shared the concern for Canada in relationship to the United States as a distinctive and different people with a very different history. And then how did we go forward with the rising of this great empire in the 60s post-World War II? So it sometimes is equated with Tory nationalism, which is very, very different, because Grant made it clear he was not a socialist. And the same with Leacock much earlier. Some of his most significant works were saying, what is the good on the right, but what is its blind spots? What is the good on the left? What is its blind spots? And some of his most productive publications, he was probably the most prolific writer in his time, was there's this via media, or middle way, again, between saying there is good in all of these positions, but when they get frozen, they often miss the good of another position that equally can come as almost a dancing partner with it. And without the two together, you get reactionary tendencies.
Yeah. So how are you using the term socialist? Are you using it in the sense of state ownership of the means of production, or in the more modern sense of state control of the means of production, or in another sense of promotion of the welfare state? So it's a slippery word in itself. So I'm wondering how would Grant understand? I feel bad. I shouldn't ask how Professor Dart sees the word, but how do you think George Grant would have understood that word socialism when he said he wasn't a socialist?
Yeah, so he would be very suspicious of the state owning the means of production. He would have some affinities with soft left liberalism, in that the state is responsible for the common good through higher taxation for citizens from coast to coast, and Canadian foreign policy, that we are a state that is concerned at the highest level for the greater good internationally. But certainly not the state owning the means of production. I mean, as you, I think, rightly know, there are various ways of understanding socialism. And Grant his Toryism, high Toryism, would take the position that the state does have a role to play. It's necessary, but not sufficient for the greater good. And it's in this tension between the role of the creative entrepreneur and individual and society, and the role of the state, that you have a vigorous and healthy and vibrant country that people are drawn to because it knows how to live the tension of the goods of different ideologies, but not freezing any of them.
Yeah. I like what you said, necessary. If you ever see me looking down too, by the way, it's because my brain lives here at the end of my fingers. I have to write or
Yes.
I can't think anything. So you mentioned necessary but not sufficient. I love that. You also mentioned via media. A previous guest was using that same term and the concept of tension. And so building on that, what do you think, and it's impossible to know for sure, but the state is so much bigger today than in Grant's day when he was calling for more involvement of the state. Do you think Toryism is wedded to the concept of state involvement as a principle, or was it merely a prudential position that they held at the time when there was more that the state could do? What we knew about state involvement in the 1960s is very different than what we know today. I think of my parents, they love free healthcare. Well, they lived through 1970s when we had more beds than we had patients to put in them. You never had to wait for anything. That's radically different from today when people die on waiting lists and old people are lined up in hallways down the hospital corridor. And yet we're spending almost as much as the highest spenders in the world. So I'm just wondering, what do you think George Grant would say about the size of the state today? Is he just devoted to a bigger, stronger state no matter what? Or would he say, this is actually representative of technocracy? He wrote an awful lot about technocracy and how that was bad, ruled by experts. So can you guess at what George Grant might say to some of those things?
Well, certainly where there's the bloating of the state, the excessive bureaucratization of the state, and as you're mentioning in the medical system, of course, some of the serious dilemmas we have with that because of our universal health care, he would certainly be raising questions about where that is going and the implications of that, and then long waits in hospitals, not only long waits in hospitals, but long waits for people with various levels of symptoms that they're having to deal with. His concern with that would be, once we start overly critiquing the state and move into private health care, this can create a form of classism in which those who have are treated at a faster pace, and their health needs can be met in a way that those who have not are put in a position that they have to wait, and that can have serious health consequences also in the long run. So, I mean, this is the argument with the increasing long waits in our healthcare system, the cost, the bureaucracy, the administration. Well, then privatization is the way to go. But this is back to the society-state dilemma once again, just applied to medicine. And Grant would raise questions about increasingly the privatization of health and the implications of that for certain people. And so the question for him would not be state versus society, but how do we have good doctors who can articulate how the state should be more efficient within the medical system so there's not the need for privatization of healthcare. And that's a long list of questions that have to be grappled with, which have developed over the decades. Mm-hmm. And so the danger, though, is to say this is going this direction with the state, therefore privatization. And that goes on with education. I mean, that's not a medical problem per se. It's like, let's trash CBC, for example, and we have private forms of media. Let's have private education. Let's do private medicine. And that has its own serious consequences and dilemmas. The Grant, as Leacock earlier, would be very concerned about where that goes. So the tendency often, people get into reactionary modes given the social conditions of any time that we're living in, our thrownness, as Heidegger would say. And it's how do we correct the aberration within a good system rather than saying we have to trash it. As Hooker once said, abuse should not prohibit use. And where you have abuse, the danger amongst some is say, well, that's the problem. No, that's a distortion of a good.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's get back to the good of it. And that will involve courageous women and men who are involved. And the same is, I mean, I've been in education, public education for more than 40 years. And I've seen the rise of private education, which some of it's being hit now, depending on which ones, because of the immigration question. And I feel for those who have cast their lots into private education, and some are losing their jobs now because of that. But I think, and Leacock and others, just not those two, there are many, many others, high Tories, who would say that there is good in affordable education and universal health care, going back, actually goes back before Tommy Douglas. And in terms of the realization that to be a minimally civilized culture and civilization, healthcare is primary, as is education for that matter, as is national broadcasting system. These are just basics of what it means for a people to belong to something bigger than their small little world, their small little society, and to be connected to a much larger human endeavor and journey.
So I apologize for raising healthcare as an example. I didn't want to take you down that pathway, and it would not be fair for me to start arguing with you about healthcare. I would only make this one comment, that so much of what you said I agree with, and I would add to that we need to put the patient at the center of any discussion. Put the student, what are they actually learning? And I think what's happened is we put politics ahead of it. We put an ideological vision of how we think society should work. We think how healthcare should be structured, as opposed to the care that patients actually need, and being willing to be flexible on that. So in other words, prioritizing the outcome of the patient and meeting the need of a suffering patient, or a student who needs an education, or whatever we're talking about. And so I'm very bullish, not as bullish as you are perhaps on the role of the state. I very much am bullish on the need for the state in so many aspects that you mentioned. My worry, though, is when we say the state is the only way to provide this. And so do you think George Grant would take that similar position and say, really, the state is not only the best, but the only way for us to get a fair education, healthcare, etc. approach? Or would he be open to partnership between the state and society?
Yes, I think the latter. I don't think Grant is frozen no more than Leacock is. Again, they live in a tension between the good of the state and the limitations of the state, and the good of society and the limitations of society. And Grant, as Leacock, would thoroughly agree with you that the good of the patient is primary, and that is not just training doctors with technical skills, but training doctors who are sensitive to human insecurity and anxiety when they're ill. Many friends of mine are doctors, and it's the same in the thing can happen in the educational system. You can have people who are well trained with technical skills and information, but they're insensitive to the needs of a person on their journey. I mean, I've often seen teaching as 80% pastoral work and 20% information. And I've had friends who've trained doctors, and they do the rounds, and they ask them after they've done the rounds, how did you diagnose this particular situation? And those who could only answer in technical terms, he said, you're not ready to become a doctor. Those who answered in more caring, compassionate, almost pastoral way, and they saw the worries, the fears that were going on in a person, he said, you are much more prepared to become a doctor than. And most of my friends who are doctors see it's almost an older pastoral vision. You obviously have to have the technical skills with it. And the same in teaching. A person can have their multiple PhDs, but in terms of teaching and caring for the students, if they don't have that, then they're not a very good teacher. They may be a scholar in a very narrow sense of the word, but in terms of the older humanities, And medicine, like teaching, at its best, it's grounded in the humanities, which is about the best for what it means to be fully human. And so, yeah, I would agree with you. And certainly a Leacock and a Grant would say if the fullness of the human is not before the teacher or the doctor or any other sphere of life, then they have not yet internalized what that particular calling, vocation, charism is.
Yeah. So many comments that we could talk about. It reminds me of Peabody's famous essay in the early 20th century, given to the graduating class at Harvard, that the most important thing in patient care is care of the patient, which is what you're saying. A guest said the other day that we need to avoid the barbarism of specialization. That was Ortega y Gasset's comment. And you're calling for that. You're saying we need to avoid the barbarism, or perhaps even the barbarism of Aristotle's techne, or not techne, episteme, book knowledge. And there's a lot more to teaching. There's a lot more to true education, to care, than simply delivering a bunch of episteme. It's about phronesis. It's about an experience that you've learned through application of wisdom to contingent situations that aren't always the same for every single student. Anyways, I'm getting off of our question list here. I wanted to ask you about Toryism and Anglicanism, and I will mess this up, but don't they say Anglicans are Tories at prayer? Is that the old joke, or how does that go? Tell me about that connection. Is there such a thing as a Toryism outside of Anglicanism?
Well, yes, certainly there's a close connection with Anglicanism and the relationship of church and state and the role of church and state working together for the common good at the best. Again, any ideal can be perverted, distorted, but the ideal. Underlying that vision is that the state has a very important role to play in the common good. And this became a tension in the 16th, 17th century with the coming to be of the Protestant Reformation, which was very much about the individual, in their case, the reading of the Bible, all being equal, using their liberty as they saw fit. And then, of course, the fragmentation that occurred in various denominations, whether Lutheran, Reformed, Mennonite, Anabaptist, Quaker. And so you get in the 16th, 17th century with this rise of liberty, individualism, agency, choice, a suspicion of the state, as well as a suspicion of the historic state church. And the Anglican tradition, which goes way back of the 16th century, that's just its newest version, said, once you start undermining these significant institutions and how they're meant to work together for the common good, you begin to get the fraying and the fragmenting and the fracturing of society. And really what we face today is just a secular version of the 16th century with its fragmentation and its ideological conflicts and its people canceling one another, the religious wars of the 16th, 17th century, the denominational wars, people not listening or hearing or heeding one another where they're grappling with very significant ideas. You just secularize that. That's where we are today. So we're just living with, it's just deja vu. It's just recycling the 16th, 17th century, just in secular version on the variations of conservatism, of progressivism. And so the older classical religious political Toryism said there is a greater good here. A greater good here. One of my best friends, you may want to interview her sometime, Diane Kaelin Sukra, Savior City, and her next follow-up book is called Leading with Civility. She's very much involved more at a municipal level, but looking at the toxicity in the culture wars and how very good people just retreat from the public fray because the trashing of them by people who are, in a very brittle way, ideologically driven. They just don't want to think at all. And so I was watching last night, I don't know if you saw it, CBC had a hour-long documentary on Jordan Peterson. And whether a person agrees with him or not, and there's legitimate questions, obviously, to be asked, and you get some people who just demonize him and others genuflect before him. The level or the lack of civil discourse when people engage in is frightening in terms of almost a barbarism that's come upon us in terms of human care and listening to those we differ with the most. Gandhi once said, keep your enemy the closest to you because there's still much you can learn from your enemy, or those who are different in terms of interpreting how we make sense of a whole range of issues we face today. So that older classical vision, which I come out of, it's a highly integrative, organic vision that began to fragment really in the 16th, 17th century. And we're just watching the reductio ad absurdum of that in our time. And understandably so, then you get people long for some sort of certainty again to hold, but then they're often become very reactive themselves. And so the certainty that they're hold to is very reductionistic, which is very worrisome. And that can come from the progressive end, and it can come from the conservative end as well. Whereas the Tory would say, put your guns in your holster and take your holster off here because you're only going to be shooting one another and everyone's going to die in the process. And it doesn't create a good, civilized, civic virtues, and it frightens good people off to the point where Yeats said, the best lack all conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And you don't want that situation. But to some degree, we are living with that to some degree today, which then breeds sort of frozen ideology. It's interesting. I just finished teaching in summer a graduate course in Dante's Commedia, and Satan is at the lowest level of the inferno, and he's frozen in his ideal. He's flapping his wings at an accelerated pace, but he's going nowhere. So he's frozen in his understanding of himself, his interpretation of reality, but he's flapping intensely his wings. And it's a lot of the ideological cultures. They're frozen in a whole range of issues, but they're extremely energetic in terms of their wings flapping and their position, but they're going nowhere. And Dante saw this clearly. So it's not a new issue. It's ever being recycled. History recycles the same issues again and again and again. And Dante has just happened to have a nice metaphor for it.
Yeah. No, I've been working through his Inferno slowly, very slowly, over the last year. I try to read a bit of poetry on the weekend. But your thoughts on, you mentioned frozen, and I wrote down in my notes here, certainty. It's a quest for certainty. Uncertainty or tension, the other word that you've used quite a few times. Tension creates stress for many people. They don't like being in that sense of tension. I know you're not a fan of Vogelin, but his word for it is metaxy. He says we're caught in between. And that sense of being caught in between things, I believe his word is from Plato, but yeah, your shout out about certainty and being frozen. You mentioned Peterson, so I have to mention Peterson. People would think that I would be a huge fan of Peterson. I have a huge respect for him. I think he's brave, obviously very brilliant, very successful, and I feel pain when I listen to him. I just get so stressed. I'm thinking this poor man just seems so worked up inside. I want to go and, I don't know, take him for a walk and say, well, why are you so wound so tightly? I guess that's just the way he is. And that's why young people, or people younger than me anyways, love to listen to him. I do like that he calls out his Jungianism, Carl Jung, and his respect or highlighting for myth and spirit and archetypes, the archetype of a mom and archetype of a father and what that means in society. And so I think there's great mileage to be had there. That's a message certainly that many people are looking for, as opposed to the rigid, materialistic, reductionistic, Freudian, you're nothing but a soup full of chemicals that make you respond. And so I think he's tapped into something there, but I do get very stressed when I listen to him. I feel so bad for the guy.
I think that's fair. It's he's right in that he hits the bullseye in terms of a certain type of certainty or gnosis, in that sense of a type of progressivism or a fragmentary liberalism or an aggressive form of liberalism that insists that their issue is the only true issue. And if you dare to question it, you're seen as the problem. And he's right to raise, because a lot of his work, I did a book. What happened is probably 7 or 8 years ago, I had so many young students coming to me that were very drawn to Peterson. I'd never heard of him. And so I did a couple of podcasts, and then a publishing company contacted me and they asked me if I would do an edited book.
Wow.
And it became Myth and Meaning and Jordan Peterson. Then he came up here for dinner with his wife, Tammy, and
Oh, wow.
had a lovely, lovely chat with them. But he's often misunderstood in that people think if he critiques the progressive, he must be a conservative. He's as equally critical of the collectivism of conservatism. He comes from and this is where I would differ with him, being a Tory, but he comes from the 16th, 17th century Lockean individualism, the Smithian tradition, not even a Burkean tradition, which Grant would critique the Burkean tradition as well. And so it's that, and his Albertan heritage always feeds into that as well, that individualism, suspicion of the state. A lot of his concern has been against totalitarianism, and he did his undergraduate degree in poli-sci and then went on to psychology from that. But the two reactions, which again reflect the illness of our culture, is he either is demonized by the certain type of progressives that don't even listen or even care to understand what he's saying, and then the certain types of conservatives, and certainly not all conservatives, that just genuflect uncritically. So you have excessive criticism and excessive lack of criticism. And so it's just trying to, how you honor another person and they're grappling with big ideas without trashing them or canceling them. That very mentality is problematic if a person even thinks that way, rather than a listening, an attentive posture and pose. The person who helped launch him actually was a student of mine, Lauren Southern.
Wow.
She was at that U at T. She was actually here this past weekend and celebrated my 75th birthday. So Lauren came over, and she's going through quite a, I've managed to get her into an MA program. Some places don't even want to touch her because of her far right. She's moved a long, long way from that. Her recent autobiography, This Is Not Real Life, is a profound critique of where she has been and the culture that reinforces that it's a very dysfunctional notion of the self and society. But yeah, so some people, when they think of Peterson, they think conservatism, and that, of course, isn't a high Tory's version of conservatism. And then I think you mentioned he seems to be like a high-strung person. They expect the strings to break or pop any moment, and you just want to say, cool it, just ease up a little bit here, get away for a vacation and rest a bit.
So I'm glad you had the same sense. I just, I feel so bad for the guy. Let's go fishing or something.
That's right.
Now, Professor Dart, I did not expect for you to mention Lauren Southern and how you've been, now you've deconstructed my image of you as this red Tory big state guy. And
No.
You're very multifaceted. I wanted to pick up on your comments about the 16th and 17th century individualism, equality, conscience, and we were discussing this a bit in our email exchange. I wonder if you could reflect on whether these were ideas that were invented in the 16th and 17th centuries, or did they just become now more emphasized? I think pulling on your classical tradition, and you think of Larry Sidentrop's book, Invention of the Individual, and he goes all the way back to Roman times and sort of traces how the concept of the individual emerged. And even, in modern day, we see Francis Fukuyama criticizing the excessive hyper-individualism that we have. And the individual would be really central to Fukuyama's understanding of political philosophy. centered on liberalism. So I wonder, can you expand on your comments about the Reformation really being the crossroads, shall we say, or the crux at which the individual equality conscience became so emphasized? Were they invented or just simply emphasized at that point in history?
Yeah, good question. I think you almost have to put in a bit of historic context to understand why it emerged. But there were two significant philosophical traditions coming out of the late Middle Ages, voluntarism and nominalism. Luther was trained within that certain Augustinian heritage that honored, and both these traditions have a certain commitment to the individual and choice and action. And so elements of the Roman Catholic Church, there increasingly had become an obviously gap between ideal and reality, but there were many Roman Catholics who were critiquing that also. One of my favorite Roman Catholics is Erasmus and Thomas More and John Colet, the Oxford reformers. So they were acutely, or as was Dante. Dante was very critical. I mean, you read the Inferno elements of the Purgatorio. I mean, Dante was way ahead of even Erasmus and More and Colet and Luther in saying the emperor has no clothes on, essentially. And Dante, like Erasmus, their works were put on the index. And Erasmus wasn't taken off the index till Vatican II. Dante a little earlier because of his friendship with Aquinas in that sense. There's some affinities with Aquinas. Anyway, but these ideas were percolating in the late 15th century. Luther was raised with these ideas. And so he takes the philosophical ideas which are percolating in theologically and exegetically, arguing that the collective can be repressive. It can distort reality, which is true, obviously. And the antidote to that is the right significance of the individual using choice, all being equal high priests before God, their agency to reform. So his works, his early pamphlets are The Liberty of the Christian Man and the Church's Babylon Captivity. He has all these metaphors which are very stark and graphic, and so these principles then are formally and materially put into play by finally the breaking from the institution of the Roman Catholic Church. What underlies it, I mean, often people, when they study this period of time, it's a return to sola scriptura, the Bible. That's not the real authority, even though at a formal level it's made to seem. The real authority is these principles of liberty and choice and agency. And many of the Protestant reformers then, because these is almost the real Nicene Creed or Apostles' Creed philosophically, then they begin to differ on whose interpretation of the Bible. If the Bible is your authority and not the church anymore, and the Pope is the vicar of Christ, then your new Pope becomes the Bible. But then the problem is whose interpretation. Unlike the Catholic Church, you can't have multiple individuals interpreting Pope any way you want. It's a different tradition entirely. It can be distorted, absolutely so. Does it have to be reformed? Absolutely so. It's again the issue of abuse does not prohibit use. And so the material and formal outworking of those principles of liberty, agency, choice, individuality, formally unfold and come into a fuller being in a way they never did in the classical tradition, whether Greek or Roman, early Christianity, patristic thought, to Middle Ages, or East or West for that matter. And so by the 16th century, Luther, Calvin, then Anabaptists, Mennonites, Baptists, Quakers in different ways, these are all emergent as multiple forms of individualism, interpreting either the self, the text, society, the church, politics, in different ways, and none can agree on the content of their choices. So fragmentation is the order of the day. And this is where you're beginning to get the breakup of Western civilization in the 16th century, which then accelerates. And with that lack of the center of a sort of a religious, political, that's when science steps in and begins to play a very important role. And so science, a certain type of science, becomes the new pope and the new vicar of reality in that sense. But that gets deconstructed a few centuries later as well. And so many people today with the deconstruction or protesting Protestants, the protesting and deconstruction motif just has accelerated and accelerated, to which suspicion and cynicism for some dominates, and they can't believe anybody or anything, which becomes its own gnosis, its own certainty. So uncertainty becomes its own certainty. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I wanted to pick up on your concept that, so you mentioned principles a number of times, and the principle of the individual, of choice, of agency, of equality, and so on. And I'm wondering whether you've had the opportunity to think about a change in anthropology. You do mention that at some points in this last book that I've been reading, the High Tory Tradition. And I'm thinking more of man, the measure of all things, Locke being more of a deist than really a theist. I haven't read these guys, but you think of Edmund Burke's comment about we're not followers of Helvetius and Voltaire, and atheists aren't our masters. I should memorize that quote from Burke. And I know you're not a huge fan of Burke either. We're going to get to that, but I'm wondering, are we witnessing perhaps a shift in anthropology, not just a shift in principles per se? So principles being an operative political approach to amplifying choice, amplifying the individual, amplifying agency. Is there an opportunity to think of that shift that you just described so well as being the outworking or the application of a shift in anthropology, where we move from the classical tradition of man is not the measure of all things to a period where man and your own independent reason is really the center, the pivot point in the universe? Have you had an opportunity to think about that? Or because I did notice hints of that in this book. You mentioned anthropology a few times.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's, again, a centuries-old question of human nature. What is human nature? And there's tended to be two distinctive, in a general sense, vision. There's obviously subtler variations of that as you go along. But one, the Aristotelian or the classical, is the issue. They use the analogy of the acorn and the oak tree. Within each person, there is the potential to be something that they are uniquely called to be, but they have to know themselves. So the know yourself, and the role of philosophy was to be, and a teacher, a midwife to a person coming to know their innate potential, but that involved discerning the difference between the wheat and the chaff, the gold and the dross, listening to something deeper. But there was almost a soul genetic code. So this was one tradition, is that the role of education and religion was to draw forth what a person actually was meant to be, and it is innately there, and each person's, their nature and their gifts are very distinct, and to the degree they work together for the common good, you have a healthy, a just, you have a peaceful society. The other is that human nature is just an open-ended book. There is no human nature. So we make reality like an open canvas. We paint on it whatever we want, and we can change that from day to day. Or like wax, we just put our own seal on it. We can change the seal tomorrow, or we change identity like we change clothes. And what I am today, I can be tomorrow. It's just choice. So really, the late modern, postmodern, this is where you get into identity politics, which is very controversial, of course, and this often divides a certain type of liberalism from a certain type of conservatism. So I think your question goes right to the core and the center of some of the intensive issues. So back of these principles of individual and choice and liberty and agency is the question of human nature. And if all we are just products of thrownness and socialization and being written on us, and then we write back in terms of defining, and we can write something different on each page as we define or understand ourselves. This is sort of the reductio ad absurdum of a certain type of liberalism. Now, a more moderate liberal, like a Charles Taylor, for example, in his Sources of the Self and Secular Society, he's trying to parse that difficult tension within liberalism itself. But yeah, in the culture wars, certainly, where you have people saying there is no such thing as human nature or human identity. We're just constantly remaking and remaking it, and we can change it just like we have this food today and that food tomorrow, or this clothes today or that clothes. So my identity, my view of myself, human nature is just an open product in the future. That has a certain appeal, but it also has a certain worrisome downside about it, because who are you today and the person I meet tomorrow? Who are you tomorrow? And if I'm chameleon, or the classical notion was Proteus, he would change shape and color at any given. And so the Greeks understood this chameleon, protean temperament. So we live in a certain wing of liberalism. The protean type or myth is very much there. And that creates serious problems. On the other hand, you don't want to freeze that classical potency act, human nature. One has to be careful about how that is understood, because that can become a little too constrictive if it's not understood properly, and cause hurt and harm as well. It can become sort of an unhealthy moralism that's dangerous. So a certain discernment, a wisdom. And because education historically, I think any good profession is, at the long run, it's about discernment and wisdom and being attentive to the moment of people and culture at any given time without being drawn to one extreme or another extreme. And Tories have always transcended the tribalism of any given moment, while recognizing both are probably onto something. That's why people are drawn to them.
Yeah. So I can't help but asking you, since you mentioned Aristotle, you mentioned discernment and wisdom, what word did you have in mind? Were you thinking more of philosophical discernment, Sophia, or were you thinking of nous as a form of insight, or what did you have in mind when you were using those words?
Well, in Aristotle, one of his great works is the Nicomachean Ethics, and the early part of it is discerning the difference between the virtues and the vices, or the shadow or the dark side and the good side. And so the early books, and then you get into books 8 and 9, friendship. So we don't do that alone, and this is for philia, Sophia. So philosophy historically was always about formation and transformation in the context of a good teacher and friends. So philosophy in that old sense isn't about playing the chess game of ideas. It's about formation, and the highest level is contemplation. And the highest level of contemplation is that nous, or noetic way of knowing, which is the deeper contemplative. It's interesting, when we had Peterson up for dinner, because of his interest in myth, and he had touched a little bit, he'd been doing some lectures on Genesis, he was moving into Exodus, and I said, have you ever thought of parsing the myth of Cain and Abel? Cain is the doer. He's the busy, the accomplisher, the performer. And he kills Abel, which is the contemplative. And we live in a culture in which, we conjugate 3 verbs: to want, to have, and to do, and we forgot what it means to be. And Abel is the shepherd of being. And conservatives can be as driven as an addictive to performance and activism as can progressives. The content may be different, but the drivenness, they're often victims of their own drivenness. And in that sense, they are Cains who kill the Abels within them, who are the shepherds of being, the contemplatives. And in Aristotle, the highest level is the contemplative, but you don't get there until one has discerned the differences between these egoistic, narcissistic elements within us, and then the good side within us. But that's done in the context of friendship, philia, Sophia. Now, logos, in that sense, is the presencing of that which is. Phronis is the outworking practically of that which is. And the noetic way of knowing is the interior contemplative faculty or organ within us that is still and quiet and receptive to the presencing of reality that is then applied in the world of engaging with people, whether it's family, whether it's wife or children or community or professions that we live in, so that we have meaningful citizenship as we engage hard issues which are not ideological in a destructive sense or that lead to tragedy in people's relationships.
That's beautiful. I'm glad I fumbled that question, but you turned that lump of coal into a diamond. That was beautiful. Now you mentioned Charles Taylor, and I didn't warn you on the email that I was going to compliment you on your chapter. It's titled Charles Taylor and the Hegelian Eden Tree, Canadian Compradorism. So quite the mouthful, but I loved how you tackled Hegel, and you said, we're talking about Hegel from front to back, top to bottom, all through Canadian politics right now. I'll just read one sentence from page 205. Quote, most of the battles in the culture wars are more about the type and form of liberalism to be defended, rather than a questioning of the foundations of liberalism itself. End quote. So as we're getting close to the 1 hour mark, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on Hegel and liberalism, the connection between Hegelianism, and Hegel's. By the way, when I read Hegel, I can barely understand him. I have to read it 4 times. He's so difficult to understand. So I won't be able to ask you any questions specifically about Hegel. But if you could talk about Hegel and Charles Taylor and liberalism and the core idea about history and time, because I think it's central in our discussions, and it relates to people being able to say, oh, Toryism's dead, it's gone, it's the past. And so just say whatever you want about Charles Taylor, Hegel, and liberalism.
Yeah, so Grant himself grew up in a Hegelian upbringing, essentially, and I mean, it's not very liberal of a liberal not to critique liberalism, but most liberals don't do that. And the irony is that a certain type of liberalism holds high critical thinking, but they're not often critical of liberalism itself as an ideology. Now, Hegel, his view of history was progressive, a dialectic. Essentially, you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis becomes. So history is a progressive movement into a greater understanding of freedom and liberty. So the past is always an inferior level of human development. So it's not that the past had no insight, it's just it's a lower level of the understanding of freedom and liberty and choice. And so Charles Taylor, I mean, he's done 2 large works on Hegel, an interpreter of Hegel, living in the tension between Hegel's understanding of liberty and community. It's not that Hegel was a fan just of liberty disconnected from community and the state. He wasn't. He understood there is this dynamic, this dialectic between the two, and how you live that dialectic and tension. But in saying that, the tension you live in is framed within liberalism as an ideology. And that's important to understand. So Charles Taylor, in his subtle and thoughtful way, being probably one of the preeminent Hegelians in Canada, attempts to articulate a moderate liberalism that would be wary of the wokeism type of liberalism that dominates, or the fragmentary type of liberalism, and we make up reality. There is no reality other than we construct and reconstruct constantly. He would argue there is an order. We are moving forward progressively into a better understanding of this tension, but the classical tradition is not to be depended on. And in that sense, both Hegel and Taylor distort classical thought. They caricature classical thought to feed into an ideological read of history as progress. And I think that's a great weakness in Taylor's thinking, as well, obviously, as in Hegel's. And as I mentioned earlier, Grant said there's only 2 great philosophers, and the rest are just commentaries, and that's Plato and Hegel. One is the great apologist for liberal modernity in a sophisticated way. The other is the great defender. There's an order, and to the degree through philosophy and theology, we come to know that, and then through our will, attune ourselves to it. We have a just, peaceful, and ecologically sane polis, country, civilization, international order. But when that is seen as a lower level of human development, and probably the leading ill of our society is memoricide, just a lack of memory of the past because of the dominance of a progressive view of history. It's a lower level, or you have certain trendy progressives only see the negative side of the past, and then they dismiss it curtly, which is very shallow intellectually and culturally. If you ask many of them how many have read an Aeschylus or a Homer or an Augustine, or they know nothing about it, but they dismiss something that they know nothing about, which is a form of arrogance, really, hubris in that old sense. So I think Taylor is the apologist of Hegel, and Hegel is the preeminent apologist of liberal progressivism. That has to be questioned. It's like cynics are often not cynical of cynicism, and deconstructionists don't deconstruct deconstructionism. So often liberals are not critical of liberalism, and yet they say critical thinking is important, but they don't criticize their own. In that sense, they're fundamentalists.
Yeah.
So the fundamentalism they critique for its certainty there is certain itself in their own principles or intellectual constructs.
Yeah, beautiful. And one of the titles of your chapters is The Matrix of Liberalism, and how we're stuck in this whole matrix. One of the guests I had on, Nathan Penkoski, was talking about Charles Taylor. He put this in one of his articles. He said, you can advance in academia if you wear your liberalism on your sleeve. And he was contrasting that with Alistair MacIntyre's work and how he did not wear his liberalism on his sleeve. He transitioned, and you mentioned MacIntyre in this book tangentially, but I get the sense that you like MacIntyre. He's in one sense, Grant's works in a more introductory way point the way to MacIntyre, because MacIntyre develops these ideas in a much fuller, more demanding, engaging, rigorous manner, and Grant was writing to an audience which didn't have the background from which MacIntyre presupposes people should have, but often don't have. Yep.
But he goes into much greater depth than Grant, but they're on much the same page. Grant, by the way, you mentioned Vogelin. Grant had a great admiration for Vogelin. Wasn't always on the same page with him, but a lot of the Europeans who came to North America, understandably so, had leanings towards certain types of liberalism, given what they'd lived under fascism and Nazism. But Vogel himself, a lot of insight in his great volumes on order and civilization, amazing works. And Grant was much fonder of him than, for example, Leo Strauss and people like that.
But he seemed to be pretty positive about Strauss, too. I'm reading through his collected works. In fact, I have it right here sitting beside me. I was going to ask you, you mentioned the international order, and I got worried. I thought, oh no, as George Grant says in Technology and Empire, he says that, I won't read the whole quote, but basically he says, a liberalism which sees the universal and homogeneous state as the highest goal of political striving. Yeah. So that was one of the rabbit holes I was going to ask you to chase down if you felt like it, because I read in Grant, when I'm reading his Technology and Empire, and his comments about technocracy and his worries about the over-bureaucratization of the state and how this is going to take over everything. I feel like if Grant was writing today, he would say, he wouldn't just be Buckley standing athwart history yelling, stop. He would be saying, the house is on fire. You guys, this is terrible. So, but yet from Professor Dart, I get a little bit more of a leaning in support of the state against the people who want to burn down the state. So anyways, I was just trying to pull out the tension there, your word, tension.
Certainly he saw the dilemmas with the universal and homogeneous state, and how the state itself would reinforce homogenizing of human needs and wants, and would deliver those, whether efficiently or inefficiently. But that became the new pope in that sense. It became the new church, just a secular state, and we turned to that to solve our problems. whether it's education or medicine or broadcasting systems, a whole range of issues. And Grant would be definitely critical, and this is where you would need a fifth column, as it were, of thinkers that would legitimately critique where that Hegelian, because I mean this comes from the Hegelian background of where a certain type of liberalism was going, which he saw so clearly that it was a matrix.
Yeah.
And be careful you don't lose your soul, as well as society in that process. So at a philosophical level, definitely he critiques that. What that would look like at a practical level, in terms of, say, medicine or education, that role of the ginger group or the fifth column, it would be abuse does not prohibit use. So be wary of trashing the state when it takes over a role it should not. And that's where society, but then Grant would be critiquing a certain type of conservatism as well. And this is why he was seen as on the left in the 50s, 60s. Then when the abortion issue became a significant issue, or family issues, he was seen on the right. He never changed at the level of principle. He just changed at the level of application of principle. So because the left had a certain agenda in regard to identity and a whole range of issues, he could see how on the left, particularly the American empire, or ecological issues or corporations, how power could lead to terrible injustice. And so he just applied that principle of the common good to the abortion issue, where the power of the woman over the unborn child, using her power to end their lives. And so he hadn't changed at the level of principle. He just saw that both sides, progressive and conservative in different ways, would insist on individual freedom, whether it's possessions, property, corporations, to undermine the weaker, the poor. And the left does exactly the same with just different issues. And in that sense, the new left, which loved Grant in the 60s, 70s, wondered if he'd lost his way by the 70s and 80s. And he hadn't changed.
Right.
The principles were the same. He just saw them being applied to different issues that he and Sheila had to address. He transcended both, as did Leacock in his time, transcended these ideologies, but he had affinities with elements of them as sort of pieces of the greater comprehensive puzzle of Toryism in that sense. And people had picked different little pieces, then they turned the pieces into the whole puzzle. And he would say, be wary of that. It will come to haunt you. It'll come like a boomerang to hit you if you're not. And this is why a good education in terms of memory then you sit with the women and men in the past who have grappled with these issues again and again, and a person is no more naive and vulnerable to be taken in by the fashion shows of the time, intellectual fashion shows. And so, which makes he and high Tory position interesting, but it gives people an alternate perspective that can see good in both and know where to support both, but not be uncritically drawn into Cyclops' cave, as it were, a one-eyed vision of things, and then the stone rolls across. And then if they're not careful, they either get eaten alive or they have to find their way out with carrying sort of sheep's clothing over them.
Oh, man. I have used up too much of your time. Do you have time for another question? Like, do you have another?
Sure.
Do you? This is a question I've been dying to ask someone who actually knows about these figures. So that's a backhanded compliment to you. So you often lump Burke, Paine, Hume, Smith, all in the same camp. They're all liberals. And so I wanted you to just unpack that a wee bit, because I'm thinking of Yuval Levin's book, The Great Debate, and he, talks about Paine versus Burke and how they had it work in debate. And Hume is listed at the front of Jerry Miller's book, Conservative Anthology. He says, this is actually the prototypical conservative because he doubted reason, but he was a great defender of habit and tradition. Sort of that was the big words for Hume. And then with respect to Smith, I was actually mentioned this. I think I mentioned this to Tom Flanagan when I had him on. I was just reading Samuel Johnson's, Boswell's Life of Johnson. That's another thing I'm slowly getting through. It's the unabridged version, so it's very, very long. But I had just read his, it was 1769. I'm pretty sure that was the year. And Boswell's asking Johnson, he says, well, what do you think about these farmers selling their corn versus cattle? Shouldn't we get in there and just enforce a steady price so that we know what to expect? We need to enforce some limits on this. And Johnson, this is pre-Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith, 1776. So this is 7 years before Smith. And Samuel Johnson, the Tory of the Tories, at least that's how I read him, he's saying, no, why would you do that? He said, when the price of wheat is dear, the farmer's going to sell wheat. And when the price of cattle is dear, the farmer's going to sell cattle. He said, we should celebrate this. And then Boswell says, well, what about rent? He said, this is terrible that these poor farmers aren't being protected. And Johnson says, no, you're not thinking about this straight. The owner needs to have a farmer, so they can't raise the rents too high. And so then Boswell says, well, maybe we need a law to then enforce a low rent. He takes the opposite position. And again, Johnson says, no, the farmer, if the rent is too high, the farmer will go be a carpenter or a blacksmith or something else. They will leave farming. And so he is addressing essentially a market-based economy within, I think, a mercantilist world. And so I say all of that to you to say, Professor Dart, you seem to be lumping all of these people together as liberals, but based on the story that I just told you about Samuel Johnson, well, then he's a liberal too. He's not a Tory. So what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, no, lovely question. Very lovely question. There are so many types of liberalism to begin with, and that's probably important. So Tom Paine is a very different type of liberalism that obviously was critiquing elements within the British state and religion at the time and for the American Revolution. And that's a certain type of almost anarchist liberalism. There's forms of liberalism, again, when you talk about market economy, the belief that through competition, a healthier state will emerge at the time. And so Burke was a Rockingham Whig, and so obviously opposed the French Revolution, but very pro-American Revolution. Tories were very suspicious of the principles being released within the founding of America, of liberty and choice, and where that ideas have consequences, to use an older work by Weaver himself. And so for someone like Burke, yes, tradition and history and habit is important to put a break on a sort of runaway Paine-like liberalism, and that's important. So the Burkean tradition, which is often seen as the standard bearer of conservatism or Toryism, his friendship with Smith and the Hume tradition, it is a form. So when people say conservatism today, thoughtful conservatives, not silly conservatives, but thoughtful conservatives, they'll turn to Burke as their gold standard in that sense. But Burke himself is a product of that increasing, in economics, market economy, that movement towards freedom and liberty. So when he has to balance the order, liberty, within elements of the emerging English tradition of Lockean tradition and within the American Revolution, he does tip his hat much more to liberty, whereas Tories see, just be wary. I mean, in the dialogue essentially between Erasmus and Luther, Erasmus says, be wary when you let that liberal genie out of the bottle. It's the Pandora's box. And as a Prometheus speaking to his brother Epimetheus, who could see where it goes, and Epimetheus doesn't. This is going to lead to fragmentation.
Hmm.
So that older tradition you find in Hooker, before that Erasmus and Thomas More, it's an older Toryism that you find embedded within significant elements of the early Canadian tradition, pre-Confederation and post, at a Leacock and a Grant, but back of them. I mean, there's a certain type, again, of progressive liberalism in Canada that trashes the family compact of Strawn and this whole group. And you want to say, I don't think you understand what they were up to in any significant way. And so I have a couple of my students now doing their thesis on the family compact, and Robertson and Strawn and Robinson Strawn, all these people. And they're engaging the emerging American empire that a Burke, a Locke, a Paine, all of these people are apologists for. And so this is quite different from Toryism, because these people, like a Prometheus, saw where this was going. And sometimes it takes centuries for the seeds of an idea to bear fruit publicly and politically, and education and religion and all of these things. And by the 16th century, the Tories saw very clearly what would happen when you open that Pandora's box. And we live with that today. So Burke would be seen, I don't know if you've had a chance to, a friend of mine, he's edited a book called Reading George Grant in the 21st Century, Tyler Chamberlain. There's a good article there on Grant and Burke that points out, and if you ever get a chance to read George Grant's English-Speaking Justice.
Yeah, I have read it. Yep.
Yeah, you can see
It's
Burke
brilliant.
will come up in that. So important to understand is Burke is, he's a liberal with conservative tendencies. But the conservatism is the adjective and the liberalism is the noun. And it's not that a Tory is against liberty, he or she isn't. Is that it's a byproduct of order and structure. And that we begin to undermine order and structure, not only in the human soul, and say you can make anything up the way you want, and there is no ethical core, we just make up ethics and we can change them from day to day. You're heading in the direction of sheer fragmentation. And so in that sense, Grant and Leacock were very suspicious, as previous ones, of Burke, as more difficult to get at because he's more subtle. Whereas Paine is obvious, Locke is obvious, Smith is obvious. Actually, Smith's more subtle than he's often made out to be. There's more to him than the Wealth of Nations.
Oh,
so to be fair to Smith, I would say these are subtler thinkers, but they're used by lesser thinkers to serve certain agendas.
No, it's a theory of moral sentiments for Smith, and then I the thing I like about Burke is, like you say, he's subtle. He didn't actually write any textbooks on philosophy, and is very much emphasizing prudentia, right? Anyways, we better not talk about Burke. You mentioned Prometheus, and I just had Grant Havers on recently talking about his new book on Marshall McLuhan. Something that I really enjoyed in that, I found McLuhan frustrating to read too, and so I would suggest people read Grant's book first, and then he explains what McLuhan is up to. But Grant brings out the concept of formal causation, and he said McLuhan was really big on trying to figure out what this innovation will lead to. So that's what you were saying about Prometheus, and if you let this cat out of the bag, look what's going to happen. And that seems to be Marshall McLuhan's, one of his major themes, is we need to think about technology before we adopt it. And of course, we've done exactly the opposite. We ignore McLuhan. But I just wonder, I ask everybody the same question at the end, and I warned you that I'd ask you this. So you've been watching Canadian politics for several decades and teaching it and writing about it. You've written over 40 books. I just learned that. What are we missing at this moment? What do you worry about when you think about Canada right now? How can we retrieve the contemplative tradition? What have I not asked you about that you think we really should be focusing on right now?
Well, probably two things. There's more, obviously, than two. One would be the problem of memoricide, no memory. So many people today, if asked, we do know, for example, if we go to bed at night, we wake up in the morning and we've lost our memory, we don't know how to orient. We are people of memory. Now, a culture that has lost its memory and the wisdom of the past and the polyphony of the past, women and men trying to make sense of these big ideas, then it leaves us bereft of how to make meaningful decisions based on the wisdom of thousands of years of grappling with these issues. And so Noam Chomsky once said memory is a form of intellectual self-defense. And in that sense, people who have no memory, they're easily taken in by the fashion shows, the trendy issues of our time, because they long for meaning. There's a human need for meaning, for purpose. And so we often turn to things that we think are going to give us a sense of direction and meaning. It's like I mentioned earlier, the Cyclops. And when Odysseus and the crew are coming home from the Battle of Troy, they're hungry, not only literally, but they're hungry for meaning. And in their hunger for meaning, because they're not deserting, they go into Cyclops' cave. And they realize they've made choices which is going to undermine meaning. And so many are hurt in the process of getting out of the cave. And of course, then Plato picks this up in the cave images too. Plato would have been raised on Homer, and he just uses the cave of Cyclops and then the shadows and people fighting over. So memoricide, I would say the recovery, and so the progressive vision of Hegel and Taylor, which we were chatting about earlier, undermines the very means we can use to recover a culture. But we have to be careful how we read that, because there are people who turn to the past, but they themselves distort the past. They turn it into a monophonic ideological read, whereas it's polyphonic, not monophonic. I would say that would be one of the first big tasks as we move in, recovering memory in a polyphonic way, not monophonic, in reaction to progressivism, which sees the past purely in a negative, lower development way. The second would be the loss of the contemplative, definitely. We think we are free today, but most people are victims of their own drivenness. They don't know how to be still for a microsecond. They have to be constantly bombarded with amusements and entertainment and noise. And you get many people, even if they have to sit still for 2 minutes or 2 seconds, they've got to, their mind is rushing like monkey on a tree, and they don't know how to be still. And so the deeper places they just don't go to. They don't even know how to go to, because what's called the vita activa, or the cane, as I mentioned earlier, has killed the able of the vita contemplativa. And in classical thought, the roots of the soul in society is the vita contemplativa. So when people are centered and their soul in society in that sense is integrated, then the fruit of the vita activa is a healthy one. But when there's disorientation and desires are not properly ordered, then you get disordered desires and disordered intellectual positions in which you get fragmentation. So of the many issues that, in terms of a prognosis, in terms of a diagnosis, using medical terms, I would say overcoming memoricide, which is that's a generation work, as well as the vita activa. They have to reverse that reversal, which has taken place since the really the 16th century, and it's accelerated with a certain type of entrepreneurialism, not only economically, but in a whole other spheres of life in which people have lost their center, and then they just become victims of a shallower understanding of identity, and then they define that arbitrarily from day to day and month to month. And of course, the fashion shows of identity and the hawkers of meaning just take advantage of the naive, and the Pied Pipers lead people all over the place. So those would be two little hints. and suggestions, and there's many others. But so my book on the high Tory tradition sort of gives the roots of the problem and potential ways forward. But that's, people have to come to grips with it in themselves to reflect. And your program, I'm sure, plays a very important role. And I mentioned earlier someone like Diane Kaelin-Sucre. You may want to have her on sometime. She lives in Chilliwack, and her book Save Your City and her new book Leading with Civility. She's a lovely, lovely person as well.
Professor Dart, this has just been fantastic. Thank you so much for making the time today.
Oh, my privilege.